this is Vivica Williams, and you're watching Head to Head. Today, we're talking about human rights protection in Ukraine. The Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union is an umbrella coalition of 27 human rights organizations, and it works to protect, empower, and advocate for human rights defenders and the organizations. The aim, improving accountability for human rights abuses and war crimes arising from the conflict in eastern Ukraine and from the illegal annexation of Crimea. To talk more about this, we're joined in the studio today by Taras Tsymbrivsky. He's the head of the USAID program, Human Rights in Action. Hello, and thank you for joining us today, Taras.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for inviting me to take part in your program.
Well, I'd like to learn more about, or for you to tell us more about, the objectives and how they're being carried out. So I know for this program, some of the objectives are increasing the monitoring of and reporting of human rights, as well as things like litigation. So what's been the format of the program so far?
Yes, let me just briefly inform you about our program and its objectives. I'm speaking on behalf of Human Rights in Action program. I'm chief of party, and this program was initially launched in 2014 as a response to the armed conflict in Ukraine. Currently, the program's objective refers to the human rights in terms of armed conflict, and this is like the general topic. In turn, it covers a number of other objectives, for example, human rights violations in the Crimea and the east of Ukraine, human rights documentation, of course, providing legal aid through our offices, which are scattered throughout the territory of Ukraine. The overall number is 9 offices, which is the platform for providing basic legal aid for the people who are affected by the armed conflict. Also, it entails strategic litigation on the national level in national courts and, of course, on the international level, namely European Court of Human Rights, International Criminal Court, and there is a significant input in this area from the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union and our co-partners, which join to our efforts. Secondly, it is the elaboration of the future framework for transitional justice in Ukraine, which is a very topical and also sensitive issue for Ukraine's future. And we also are greatly contributing into this area so far. We have ignited this discussion on the national level here, involving academia at first, because we initiated a big conference in order to push this issue on a large scale in Ukraine. Afterwards, we made a big publication, which was the follow-up of this initiative. And the latest developments in this area are referring to the future draft law, which will cover the issue of transitional justice, which is something brand new for the Ukrainian society, but inevitable in the nearest future.
All right. Well, and let's talk about, then there's a lot of things that the organization is covering, the program's covering. That's got to be a lot of work. Let's look at from a local view at the moment. You said you have 9 offices, and can you tell us about what's going on the local level, especially in the frontline territories when it comes to increasing monitoring, awareness, and prosecution of human rights violations?
Our local offices, which are providing legal aid in the field, they are an integral part of our general activities, and they are making a great input into the activities of our other departments, and we are working thus very comprehensively. Their main mission roots in monitoring of human rights violations and also passing valuable information to our documentation center of human rights violations.
And can you give us some examples of some of the cases that have come before you or that have been passed on and some of the results from this?
Yes, we have a number of success stories which make a great impact in the Ukrainian society. For example, our lawyers from the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union recently were involved in the case which abolished the verification of IDP pensioners. And this will have a very big impact for the Ukrainian society, and we will monitor this situation henceforward. And also we have a number of less significant cases, but still they are very important for the people who are very vulnerable and very much affected by this conflict. And this is like the red line which crosses all the armed conflict in Ukraine, this human rights dimension, and this is of our peculiar attention, and we will push all our initiatives in this direction henceforward, also together with building up coalition with our partners, because as you mentioned before, it is a very large amount of work, but still we are very committed to this idea in order to contribute in this area.
And so the the organizations working then in the territories near the front line, as well as ones that are not that close, they're dealing with some of the same issues, some of the that have arose from the war, from the annexation of Crimea?
Yes, almost all of our cases are directly connected with the violations arising from the armed conflict, namely the violations of the basic human rights, crossing the contact lines, the property rights, the right to life.
Well, what are some specific types of cases that you see, say, away from the conflict zone? Because I imagine you have centers that are not necessarily just in the front line, but also ones that deal with issues brought up by IDPs, I'd imagine, that have faced some human rights violations, some issues while leaving the conflict area.
Also, let me mention one of the bright examples of our input into these activities, the abolition of the provisions which were discriminatory to the people who were crossing the line, the borderline with the Crimea, which is under occupation of the Russian Federation, and there was a restricted list of goods which could be transferred to the territory of Ukraine, and being meanwhile very important for these people. And this was also a big advantage we took off as a result of our activities in this area. And also there are a great many other things which are very topical for the Ukrainian society. On the international scale, I would also mention the submission by the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union to the human rights violations to the International Criminal Court, which considers a great many information from the non-governmental organizations together with submissions from the Ukraine in general. And we have slight implications that we will have some sort of breakthrough in this area, since the latest reports of the prosecutor office of ICC gives a slight hopes in this direction, since it has already stated that the overall situation in Ukraine might be qualified as an international armed conflict. So we have this is the reflection that the climate of impunity which is prevailing at now would be diminished.
And can you speak a little bit more about that, about this change in the classification of the conflict in Ukraine?
Yes, the situation in Ukraine is quite complicated from the standpoint of international law, and for the majority of people it is very difficult to distinguish between the classification of the armed conflict and its application in the Ukrainian context. And this is a very favorable soil for leveraging on behalf of Russian Federation and disseminating false messages to its population and also abroad. And the main problem consists in that Russia Federation is insisting that it is like civil war or non-international armed conflict, refuting any arguments about its involvement in the armed conflict in Ukraine. But still, a number of facts, they prove different things in the light of reconnaissance information, also information which is available in the open sources, and everybody can make its own conclusions. And so far we have very valuable findings of the International Criminal Court. Of course, it hasn't opened investigation yet, but it's very close to this. Let me just remind you that a number of years has passed since this situation, in terms of the situation in Georgia, yes, and but I am more than sure that it won't be the case for Ukraine, and it would take much less time. And nowadays, the International Criminal Court has definitely stated that the situation in the Crimea refers to the international armed conflict, and this means that the Russian Federation is the occupying power and is responsible for administering as an occupying power for these territories, and also respecting rights of the people who are living in this territory. And this is quite clear from the standpoint of international law, but still it is not the case for the east of Ukraine, since the involvement of Russian Federation, which is acting through its proxies on the territory of Ukraine, is still unclear, because we have some implications of its direct involvement, and also it's like not direct involvement. It like depends on the
it's a hybrid movement, right? It's this mix.
It's sort of hybrid, yes, but
it also depends on the location or the.
But it shouldn't be misleading, because hybrid is not the term which is used by the international law, and there is not such concept so far, at least, in international instrument like a hybrid war.
What are the terms they use to describe?
Traditional terms which are used in this situation is international armed conflict or non-international armed conflict. And
yet the way the world has changed, there needs to be some updating of definitions.
Of course, I do accept this approach, which means that the real life is expanding much faster than the international instruments and its provisions. Of course, it's easier for us to use hybrid war, and we more or less know what it means for us, but still in terms of international law, it's something which is not existing yet, but I'm sure that it will come, especially in the light of the recent developments of waging war, because a war in the traditional terms, linear war, is no more the war we were used to. We are talking nowadays about this cyber warfare, about informational...
Mix of using different
campaigns, and what is interesting, at least from my observation, that Russia Federation prefers to wage war in traditional terms with the weaker countries, yes, but with the stronger countries it uses some other means, namely informational warfare or intrusions into the cyber domain. And this platform, it generates immense possibilities for Russia Federation or other countries, since the anonymity you can leverage can bring a lot of benefit.
And as you said about the lagging of international law compared to where we are, these things they're not covered so much under international law. It's still developing. There's no definitions. There's we know how to, rather international law knows how to deal with conventional, unconventional warfare, international, civil, but the idea of these mixes of using different non-traditional methods of warfare is something new. And tell us a bit more about, with the program, so as a takeaway, what's the next steps and what's being looked at next for this Human Rights Action program?
Of course, we are moving forward and looking backwards what we have gained so far, and we feel very inspired by our activities, and we are looking forward to our next activities. In terms of the latter, I would like to share some basic information. We would be engaged in crafting legislation in Ukraine. So far, we have contributed to elaboration of a number of laws. For example, recently the law has been adopted concerning the missing people in Ukraine, especially which covers a number of issues concerning people who were missing in terms of armed conflict. Also, we would push the adoption of the law which would refer to the transitional justice. This is the framework law which was the result of mutual efforts together with the Office of Ombudsman, a number of MPs of Ukrainian parliament and representatives of non-governmental organizations. And still there are a number of other initiatives within this direction, including some educational initiatives which are connected with the dissemination of knowledge concerning transitional justice, also empowering people with skills in order to defend their rights, also trainings for trainers, yes, and a number of such activities. We are always reviewing our activities in light of the challenges and developments, so we will push these issues, I'm promising.
And we look forward to seeing some more of the results and outcomes. So far, looks like a lot has been developed, a lot of legislation, a lot of positive changes have come from the program, and we look forward to seeing more. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And that was Taras Tsymbrivsky. He's the head of the USAID program, Human Rights in Action program. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned to UATV.